The barn doors swung open with a dramatic creak that echoed across my property like thunder. Corinne Thompson stood there with her clipboard raised high, her finger pointing directly at the golden brown piles stacked neatly inside my barn. Her voice carried the triumphant tone of someone who believed they had just exposed the crime of the century. "There it is, illegal grain storage without proper permits," she declared to the county inspectors, the HOA board members, and even the local news crew she had somehow convinced to document this moment. I watched as the lead inspector stepped forward, pulled on his gloves, and reached down to examine what Corinne was absolutely certain would vindicate months of harassment and accusations. The silence stretched like a taut wire as he lifted a handful of the material to his nose. His face changed instantly. That was the moment I knew Corinne Thompson had made the biggest mistake of her life. My name is Marcus, and I had built what I thought was the perfect life on 5 acres of rolling hills just outside Millbrook Heights. The property sat right on the edge of the HOA boundaries, technically exempt from their rules but close enough to enjoy the maintained roads and shared amenities. I had purchased this slice of heaven 3 years ago with dreams of sustainable living and organic farming. The red barn stood as the centerpiece of my operation, weathered but sturdy, with wide doors that opened to reveal my pride and joy. Inside, I carefully stored what would become the foundation of my organic farming success. Dried cow dung, aged to perfection, transformed into the most nutrient-rich fertilizer you could imagine. The process took months of careful monitoring, turning and drying, until it reached that perfect golden brown color that meant it was ready to nourish my crops. My neighbors had grown to love me over the years. Every weekend, I would load up my truck with fresh tomatoes, corn, and squash to share with anyone who wanted them. Mrs. Peterson next door always said my vegetables were the best she had ever tasted. The Martinez family would send their kids over with baskets, and I would fill them with whatever was ready for harvest. That peaceful existence began to change when Corinne Thompson moved into the neighborhood and immediately ran for HOA president. She won by promising to clean up the area and protect property values from what she called unsightly violations. Corinne was the kind of woman who measured grass height with a ruler and kept a digital camera ready for any infraction she might discover. The first time I met Corinne, she was standing at my property line with a measuring tape extended toward my barn. She wore a crisp white shirt tucked into perfectly pressed khaki pants, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. "Excuse me," I called out as I walked toward her. "Can I help you with something?" She looked up from her clipboard and gave me a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm Corinne Thompson, the new HOA president. I'm conducting a neighborhood assessment to ensure everyone is in compliance with community standards." I gestured toward the property marker clearly visible between us. "Well, my property is actually outside the HOA boundaries, so I think you might be wasting your time here." Her smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. "We'll see about that," she said, making a note on her clipboard. "What exactly are you storing in that barn?" The question caught me off guard. "It's fertilizer for my organic farming operation. Why do you ask?" Corinne's eyes narrowed as she took several photos of my barn with her phone. "Fertilizer," she repeated, making another note. "And you have permits for agricultural storage, I assume." I felt my first flash of irritation. I don't need permits for storing fertilizer on my own property for personal use. She clicked her pen and tucked her clipboard under her arm. "We'll see about that too," she said before turning and walking away. That night, I could not shake the feeling that Corinne Thompson was going to be a problem. I had dealt with difficult neighbors before, but something about her methodical approach and the way she had photographed my barn made me uneasy. She carried herself like someone on a mission, and I had the sinking feeling that I had somehow become her target. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Corinne driving slowly past my property at different times of the day. Sometimes she would stop and take more photos. Other times she would simply sit in her car and stare at my barn as if she was studying it for some hidden secret. I tried to dismiss her behavior as the overzealousness of a new HOA president, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Corinne's casual drive-bys evolved into what she called official HOA inspections within a month. She assembled a team of volunteers from the neighborhood, each armed with clipboards, cameras, and an official-looking badge that read HOA Compliance Officer. The badges were laminated and hung from lanyards, giving her little army an air of authority that was both impressive and ridiculous. The first official inspection happened on a Tuesday morning at exactly 7 o'clock. I was drinking coffee on my porch when 3 cars pulled up to my property line. Corinne emerged from the lead vehicle wearing what looked like a uniform, a navy blue polo shirt with HOA President embroidered on the chest, and matching pants with cargo pockets filled with inspection tools. "Good morning, Marcus," she called out with false friendliness. "We're here to conduct a routine compliance inspection based on several anonymous reports we've received." I set down my coffee and walked toward the group. Anonymous reports about what exactly? Corinne consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. Illegal agricultural business operations, improper storage of grain products, and potential zoning violations. She looked up at me with those cold eyes. "We have reason to believe you're running a commercial grain storage facility without proper permits." The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. "Corinne, that's not grain in my barn. It's dried cow dung that I use for fertilizer. I've told you this before." She made a note on her clipboard and nodded to her team. They began taking measurements of my barn, photographing it from every angle, and creating what looked like a crime scene investigation report. One volunteer even had a tape measure and was documenting the exact dimensions of the structure. The material in question appears to be golden in color and granular in texture, Corinne announced to her team as if she was delivering a scientific analysis. "This is consistent with wheat or other grain storage typically found in commercial agricultural operations." I watched in amazement as she continued her elaborate documentation process. She had forms for everything: structural measurements, photographic evidence logs, and what appeared to be witness statements from neighbors who claimed they had seen suspicious agricultural activity on my property. "Look," I said, trying to maintain my patience, "I'd be happy to show you exactly what's in the barn. It's organic fertilizer that I make from cow manure. There's nothing illegal about it." Corinne held up her hand to stop me. "We'll need to complete our preliminary investigation before examining any evidence. This is a serious matter that requires proper documentation." Over the following weeks, Corinne's inspections became a regular occurrence. She would arrive with her team at different times, always claiming new anonymous reports had been filed. Each visit became more elaborate than the last, with additional forms, more photographs, and increasingly aggressive questioning about my grain storage operation. The community began to divide along clear lines. My longtime neighbors like Mrs. Peterson and the Martinez family continued to support me, but newer residents started to view me with suspicion. Corinne had begun hosting community information sessions, where she would present her findings about my alleged violations and their potential impact on property values. I decided to do my own research and contacted the county clerk's office to verify my property's HOA status. The records confirmed what I already knew. My land was purchased specifically because it sat outside the HOA boundaries. I was legally exempt from their rules and regulations. When I confronted Karen with this information, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Property boundaries can change," she said, "and even if you're technically outside our jurisdiction, you're still subject to county agricultural regulations." That was when I realized Karen was not just mistaken about my barn's contents. She was building a case based on completely false assumptions and had no intention of listening to facts that contradicted her theory. The final straw came when Karen began showing up at 6 in the morning for what she called surprise inspections. She would arrive with her team and spend hours documenting everything from the position of my truck to the height of my grass, all while treating my peaceful farm like a criminal investigation site. I knew I had to take action before Karen's obsession escalated into something even more serious, but I had no idea just how far she was willing to go to prove her case. The first official letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail with the weight and authority of government bureaucracy behind it. The return address read County Agricultural Inspector's Office, and my hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal complaint alleging illegal agricultural business operations on my property, complete with photographic evidence and detailed accusations. The letter demanded that I provide documentation for my agricultural storage permit, business license, and environmental impact assessment within 30 days or face potential fines and legal action. As I read through the allegations, I realized that every single detail had come directly from Karen's inspections. She had somehow convinced county officials that I was running a commercial grain storage facility without proper permits. Before I could fully process the first letter, 2 more arrived that same week. The Department of Environmental Protection wanted to investigate potential groundwater contamination from my grain storage operation. The county zoning board had received complaints about commercial agricultural activity in a residential area. Each letter referenced the same photographic evidence and the same detailed reports that Karen had been compiling for months. I knew I needed legal help, so I drove to the county seat and met with Robert Chen, an attorney who specialized in agricultural law and property disputes. His office was cluttered with law books and case files, and he listened to my story with the patient attention of someone who had seen similar situations before. "This is harassment," he said after reviewing all the letters and Karen's documentation. "But it's sophisticated harassment. She's using the system exactly as it was designed, filing complaints through proper channels with enough detail to trigger automatic investigations." Robert's assessment was both reassuring and terrifying. While Karen's complaints were based on false information, the investigations they triggered were real and expensive to defend against. He estimated that properly responding to all the allegations would cost at least $15,000 in legal fees and expert testimony. While I was dealing with the legal bombardment, Karen launched her media campaign. She created a Facebook page called Millbrook Heights Community Safety and began posting daily updates about what she termed dangerous farming operations, threatening neighborhood safety. Her posts included photographs of my barn, aerial views of my property taken from a drone, and warnings about potential contamination of local water supplies. The social media campaign was brilliant in its simplicity. Karen never mentioned my name directly, instead referring to agricultural violations and illegal grain storage in a way that allowed her to avoid defamation claims while still targeting me specifically. Within days, her posts were being shared throughout the community and neighboring areas. The isolation began almost immediately. Neighbors who had previously waved from their yards now avoided eye contact when I drove past. The Martinez family stopped sending their children over for vegetables. Mrs. Peterson, who had been like a grandmother to me, seemed nervous and distracted during our conversations. The breaking point came when Corinne organized what she called a community protection meeting at the local community center. She had somehow convinced the facility manager that this was an official HOA emergency session, and nearly 60 residents showed up to hear her presentation about the threats to their property values and personal safety. I learned about the meeting from a neighbor who still supported me, and I decided to attend to defend myself. Corinne had prepared a PowerPoint presentation complete with photographs, charts showing potential property value impacts, and a timeline of what she called escalating violations on my property. When I stood up to speak, Corinne immediately called for a vote to exclude me from the meeting since I was not a member of the HOA in good standing. The vote was close, but enough residents supported my exclusion that I was asked to leave by the facility manager. As I walked out of that meeting, I realized that Corinne had successfully turned my entire community against me using nothing but false accusations and manufactured fear. She had weaponized bureaucracy, social media, and community anxiety to destroy my reputation and isolate me from my neighbors. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the stack of government letters and legal documents that had consumed my dining room table. I had spent 3 years building a peaceful life on this land, and Corinne Thompson was systematically destroying it with lies and manipulation. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply defending myself against Corinne's attacks, I was going to fight back. I was going to expose her lies, document her harassment, and make sure that no one else in my community would ever have to endure what she had put me through. The war was just beginning. The convoy arrived like a military operation on a crisp autumn morning that would forever change both of our lives. Corinne led the procession in her pristine white SUV, followed by a county inspector's truck, 2 additional HOA board member vehicles, and what appeared to be a local news van complete with satellite equipment and camera crew. I watched from my kitchen window as the vehicles formed a semicircle around my property line, their occupants emerging with the coordinated precision of a well-rehearsed performance. Corinne stepped out wearing what looked like a new outfit, a professional navy blue blazer over pressed khaki pants, with her hair styled in a way that suggested she expected to be on camera. The county inspector was a middle-aged man named David Rodriguez, who approached my front door with obvious reluctance. Behind him, Corinne marshaled her forces like a general preparing for battle, pointing toward my barn and distributing copies of her documentation to anyone who would take them. "Mr. Marcus," Inspector Rodriguez said when I opened the door, "I'm here to investigate reports of unpermitted agricultural storage on your property. I apologize for the circus, but the complaint was filed with enough detail that we're required to conduct a full inspection." I glanced over his shoulder at Corinne, who was now speaking animatedly to the news crew while gesturing toward my barn. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a microphone, was nodding seriously as Corinne explained what she clearly expected to be her moment of vindication. "I understand," I told the inspector. "Would you like me to show you what's actually in the barn?" Karen must have overheard because she immediately approached us with her clipboard and camera ready. Inspector Rodriguez, I've documented months of suspicious activity at this location. The evidence clearly shows illegal grain storage in violation of multiple county regulations. The inspector looked at Corinne with the weary expression of someone who had dealt with overzealous complainants before. Ma'am, I appreciate your diligence, but I'll need to conduct my own assessment of the situation. As we walked toward the barn, Corinne continued her running commentary for the benefit of the news camera that was now following our procession. As you can see, the structure is clearly being used for commercial agricultural storage without proper permits. The golden color of the stored material is consistent with wheat or corn products. The barn doors had been closed since Corinne's last inspection, and I could feel the tension building as we approached them. Corinne positioned herself directly in front of the news camera, her expression radiating the confident satisfaction of someone who believed they were about to be proven right in the most public way possible. "This is the moment we've all been waiting for," she announced to the camera with theatrical flair. "The evidence of illegal agricultural operations that have been threatening our community safety and property values for months." I reached for the barn door handles and paused for a moment, looking at Corinne's face. She was practically glowing with anticipation, her phone ready to record what she clearly expected to be her triumphant vindication. The news reporter had positioned herself for the best camera angle, and even some of the HOA board members were leaning forward in anticipation. The doors swung open with their familiar creak, and sunlight streamed into the barn, illuminating the neat piles of golden-brown material that had caused so much controversy. For a moment, everyone was silent as they stared at what Corinne had been absolutely certain was illegally stored grain. Inspector Rodriguez stepped forward, pulled on a pair of latex gloves, and reached down to examine the material. The silence stretched like a taut wire as he lifted a handful to his nose and took a careful sniff. His expression changed immediately from professional skepticism to barely contained amusement. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Corinne, "this is dried cow manure. It's organic fertilizer." The words hit Corinne like a physical blow. Her confident expression cracked, and she stared at the inspector as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "That's impossible," she stammered. "I've been monitoring this storage for months. The color, the texture, it's clearly grain." Inspector Rodriguez took another sample and held it up for everyone to see. "This is definitely dried cow dung, aged for use as organic fertilizer. It's completely legal, requires no permits for personal use, and poses no threat to the community." I watched as Corinne's entire world began to collapse in real time. Months of investigations, accusations, and public presentations had just been reduced to their most basic truth. She had been wrong about everything from the very beginning. The news crew, sensing that their story had just taken an unexpected turn from agricultural violation to public embarrassment, began packing up their equipment. The reporter approached Corinne for a comment, but Corinne was staring at the barn contents with the stunned expression of someone whose entire reality had just been shattered. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "The reports, the documentation, the analysis." Inspector Rodriguez completed his official examination and turned to me with an apologetic smile. "Mr. Marcus, your organic farming operation is completely legal and properly maintained. I'll file a report clearing you of all allegations." As the convoy began its awkward retreat, Corinne made one last desperate attempt to salvage her credibility. "There must be some mistake," she called out to the departing news crew. This requires further investigation. But nobody was listening anymore. The truth had finally emerged, and Karen Thompson's campaign of harassment had just collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. The news of Karen's spectacular failure spread through Millbrook Heights like wildfire. By evening, my phone was ringing constantly with neighbors calling to apologize, offer support, or simply express their amazement at what had transpired. Mrs. Peterson was the first to arrive at my door with a homemade apple pie and tears in her eyes. "Marcus, I am so sorry," she said, gripping my hands with surprising strength. "I should have trusted you. I should have spoken up when I saw what she was doing to you." The Martinez family came by that evening with their children, who ran straight to my vegetable garden as if nothing had ever changed. Roberto Martinez pulled me aside with a serious expression. "We never believed her stories," he said quietly, "but we were afraid to say anything. She made it seem like speaking up would hurt our property values." As the community rallied around me, I realized that Karen's downfall had revealed something important about my neighbors. Most of them had never truly believed her accusations, but they had been afraid to challenge her authority. Fear of conflict and concern about property values had kept them silent while she systematically destroyed my reputation. But I was not ready to simply accept apologies and move on. The months of harassment, the legal fees, the government investigations, and the damage to my reputation deserved consequences. I contacted Robert Chen and told him I wanted to pursue legal action against Karen for harassment, defamation, and filing false reports. "You have an excellent case," Robert said during our meeting. "Her documentation actually works against her now. Every photograph, every report, every social media post becomes evidence of a sustained campaign of harassment based on false accusations." Karen apparently realized the severity of her situation because she began making private visits to neighbors, trying to arrange what she called informal meetings to discuss settling our dispute quietly. Mrs. Peterson told me that Karen had come to her house, offering to pay for any damages if I would just let this whole thing go. The more I investigated Karen's behavior, the more disturbing the pattern became. Robert helped me file public records requests for all of Karen's HOA activities, and what we discovered was shocking. Over the past year, she had filed similar complaints against 6 other residents for various alleged violations. There was Tom Bradley, who received county citations for illegal automotive repair because he changed his own oil in his driveway. Sandra Williams faced environmental investigations for improper composting of her kitchen scraps. Each case followed the same pattern. Karen would identify some normal household activity, reframe it as a violation, and then use official channels to harass residents into compliance. Most disturbing was the case of elderly Martha Hoffman, who had been forced to hire a lawyer to defend against Karen's claims that her vegetable garden constituted illegal agricultural activity. Martha had spent over $3,000 in legal fees before the county dismissed Karen's complaints as frivolous. I began reaching out to these victims, and we formed what we informally called the Karen Thompson Survivors Group. Each person had a similar story of harassment, false accusations, and expensive legal battles to defend against manufactured violations. Together, we began documenting the full scope of Karen's abuse of the HOA system. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen had weaponized bureaucracy to terrorize anyone who did not conform to her vision of neighborhood perfection. She had cost residents thousands of dollars in legal fees, damaged relationships throughout the community, and created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had poisoned our once peaceful neighborhood. Robert recommended that we file a class action lawsuit against Corinne for harassment and abuse of process. She's used the legal system as a weapon, he explained. Courts take that very seriously, especially when there's a pattern of behavior affecting multiple victims. As I organized the legal response, I also began documenting every aspect of Corinne's harassment campaign. I created a detailed timeline of her inspections, photographed all her social media posts before she could delete them, and collected witness statements from neighbors who had observed her behavior. The transformation from victim to advocate felt empowering in a way I had not expected. For months, I had been reacting to Corinne's attacks, defending myself against false accusations, and trying to prove my innocence. Now I was taking control of the narrative and holding her accountable for the damage she had caused. Corinne's attempts at private apologies became increasingly desperate as word spread about the legal action. She left voicemails promising to make substantial financial compensation for any inconvenience she had caused. She sent text messages claiming that her complaints had been based on misunderstandings that could easily be resolved without involving lawyers. But it was too late for quiet settlements. Corinne Thompson had declared war on my peaceful existence, and now she was going to face the consequences of that decision. The community she had divided through fear and manipulation was uniting against her, and justice was finally within reach. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was winning. The courthouse steps felt like the site of a historic victory as I walked up them with Robert Chen and 3 other Corinne Thompson victims. Our class action lawsuit had gained momentum quickly once word spread throughout the community. What had started as my individual case of harassment had evolved into a comprehensive legal challenge to Corinne's systematic abuse of HOA authority. Inside the courtroom, Corinne sat at the defendant's table with her own attorney, a tired-looking man who seemed to understand that his client's position was hopeless. Corinne had aged visibly over the past few months. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and she wore a simple black dress instead of her customary authority-projecting outfits. Judge Margaret Sullivan reviewed the evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had seen similar cases before. Our documentation was extensive months of photographs, reports, social media posts, and witness testimonies that painted a clear picture of systematic harassment and abuse of process. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Sullivan said, looking over her reading glasses, "you filed complaints with county officials alleging illegal agricultural operations, environmental violations, and zoning infractions. These complaints triggered expensive investigations and legal proceedings for multiple residents. The evidence shows that your accusations were based on false assumptions, and in some cases, complete fabrications." Corinne's attorney attempted to argue that his client had been acting in good faith as an elected HOA official, but the judge cut him off with a stern look. "Good faith requires some basis in fact, counselor. Mrs. Thompson's own documentation shows a pattern of harassment that goes far beyond reasonable enforcement of community standards." The testimony from other victims was devastating. Martha Hoffman, the elderly woman who had been forced to defend her vegetable garden, spoke about the stress and financial burden of Corinne's false accusations. Tom Bradley described how Corinne's automotive repair complaint had nearly cost him his job when his employer learned about the environmental investigation. Each story revealed the same pattern. Corinne would identify some normal household activity, reframe it as a violation, and then use official channels to terrorize residents into submission. The cumulative impact was a community living in fear of their own HOA president. Judge Sullivan's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Karen was ordered to pay restitution to all victims for their legal fees and associated costs. She was also issued a permanent restraining order, preventing her from filing any further complaints against residents without prior court approval. But the legal victory was only the beginning of Karen's downfall. The community had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to address what residents were calling the Karen Thompson crisis. The meeting was held at the same community center where Karen had once presented her case against me, but this time the roles were reversed. Nearly 100 residents packed the room as HOA Board Secretary Janet Morrison called the meeting to order. Karen sat alone in the front row, isolated from the community she had once tried to control. Her usual supporters had abandoned her once the extent of her harassment campaign became public knowledge. "We are here tonight to address the systematic abuse of HOA authority by our current president," Janet announced to the room. "The evidence presented in recent legal proceedings shows a pattern of harassment and false reporting that has damaged our community and cost residents thousands of dollars in unnecessary legal fees." The vote to remove Karen from the HOA board was not even close. 87 residents voted for removal, with only 3 abstentions and no votes in favor of keeping her in office. The new board immediately implemented oversight procedures requiring multiple signatures for any official complaints, and established an appeals process for residents facing HOA enforcement actions. Karen's final attempt to maintain control came in the form of threats and intimidation. She began leaving voicemails for board members warning them about legal consequences for removing her from office. She sent text messages claiming that she had documentation that would expose corruption in the community. But her threats carried no weight anymore. The county had launched its own investigation into Karen's abuse of the complaint system, and she was facing potential criminal charges for filing false reports and wasting government resources. The financial consequences of the lawsuit had also taken their toll. Karen's house went up for sale shortly after the court ruling. The new HOA leadership, headed by Janet Morrison and Roberto Martinez, immediately began repairing the damage Karen had caused. They reached out to all residents who had faced harassment, established a community mediation program for dispute resolution, and created new policies protecting residents from arbitrary enforcement actions. The transformation was remarkable. Within weeks, the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had poisoned our neighborhood began to dissipate. Neighbors started talking to each other again instead of wondering who might be filing complaints against them. Karen's reign of terror was over, but the scars she had left on our community would take time to heal. 6 months later, I stood in my barn looking at the same piles of dried cow dung that had started this entire ordeal. The fertilizer looked exactly the same as it always had: golden brown, carefully aged, and ready to nourish my crops. But everything else had changed completely. Karen Thompson was gone. Her house had sold quickly after the court ruling, and she had moved to another state to escape the financial and social consequences of her harassment campaign. The county had ultimately decided not to pursue criminal charges, but the civil lawsuit had cost her nearly $50,000 in restitution and legal fees. The final court order had been comprehensive and satisfying. Judge Sullivan had ruled that Karen's actions constituted malicious abuse of legal process and had awarded damages to all 7 victims of her harassment campaign. More importantly, the ruling established a legal precedent that would protect other communities from similar abuse of HOA authority. My relationship with my neighbors had not just returned to normal, It had grown stronger through the shared experience of standing up to a bully. Mrs. Peterson still brought me homemade pies, but now she also served as the community's unofficial historian, documenting the lessons learned from the Karen Thompson crisis. The Martinez family had become my closest allies in the neighborhood. Roberto now served as HOA vice president, and their children still ran through my vegetable garden every weekend. The trust that had been damaged by months of manufactured fear had been rebuilt through collective action and mutual support. The new HOA policies had transformed our community governance. Instead of top-down enforcement based on individual complaints, we now had a collaborative approach that emphasized communication and problem-solving. Disputes were handled through mediation rather than official citations, and residents felt comfortable approaching the board with concerns instead of living in fear of arbitrary enforcement. I had also become something of a local celebrity, though not in a way I had ever wanted. The story of Karen's barn raid had spread beyond our community, and other neighborhoods dealing with HOA harassment had reached out for advice and support. I found myself speaking at community meetings and consulting with residents facing similar situations. The most important change was in my own perspective. I had learned that standing up to bullies requires more than just being right. It requires documentation, community support, and the willingness to use legal channels when necessary. I had also learned that most people want to do the right thing but often need someone else to take the first step. Robert Chen had kept all of Karen's documentation as evidence, and we now used it as a teaching tool for other communities. Her meticulous records of false accusations and manufactured violations served as a perfect example of how reasonable-sounding complaints can be used to weaponize bureaucracy against innocent people. As I worked in my garden that evening, spreading the same fertilizer that had caused so much trouble, I reflected on the lessons of the past year. Karen Thompson had taught me that authority without accountability is dangerous, that fear can divide communities, and that justice sometimes requires fighting back rather than simply hoping problems will resolve themselves. But she had also inadvertently taught me about the power of community, the importance of standing up for others, and the satisfaction that comes from holding bullies accountable for their actions. Our neighborhood was now stronger, more unified, and better protected against future abuse of authority. The dried cow dung in my barn would continue to nourish my crops, just as the experience of fighting Karen Thompson had nourished my understanding of justice, community, and the importance of never backing down when you know you are right. Sometimes the best fertilizer comes from the messiest situations, and sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most difficult confrontations.